Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. We are the Exposing Mold team. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with co-host Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami. Today we're going to talk with Alicia about mold avoidance. We have learned about mold avoidance from Eric, and Alicia has been practicing mold avoidance since she first left her first moldy home. Now, a common occurrence as you're in the initial processes of navigating mold avoidance and figuring out really what it is from the inside out, a lot of us tend to go on accident from one moldy place to another as we're working on refining our senses. That's happened to me. I know Eric has been in repeated exposures. I think it's par for the course when you see and hear people talking about how do I keep ending up in mold? It's really that we haven't developed our mold avoidance strategies, like refine them enough to be able to use our senses to go into an environment and feel really clearly if that environment is going to be a big fit for us. And we sometimes over rely on testing and not our senses, which that's not what Alicia did, but some people do. So Alicia, I know you guys left your house in Oregon once you kind of realized, like, I know you had this epiphany where you were like, you said to your husband, if I don't get out, I'm literally going to die. Like, we have to go. And I know that you stumbled on Eric's like mold avoidance, and you guys tell us a little bit about your journey, like what you guys did when you left, what you were inspired by, how you ended up at the place in Arizona, and then what that journey was like to propel you a little bit to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. At that time when we were in Oregon, I was so sick. I didn't think I was going to make it. I was just having these crazy attacks where my oxygen would dip so low and my heart rate would be so high and then it would dip super low. And it was just this constant barrage of bad symptoms. And I was working with a mold doctor at the time and also talking with Eric, trying to just put the pieces together. There's like a series of things we all go through, I feel like, as I guess figuring out that mold is our issue, right? We don't want to believe it. Like there's some sort of ambivalence in the beginning. And then you start to really understand, like, holy crap, this is the mold and I need to get out. So I finally got to that point once, we got all this information. We got our mold tests back in the home, and the mold doctor saying, your blood tests are bad. You have mold in your house, get out. To Eric saying, all right, you got to get out, do these different types of things for mold avoidance. So at that point, we had just left. It's as easy and as hard as just leaving, right? There's so many things that you have to do if you really want to do this right. And so we just left, and we didn't know where we were going to go. We just lived in our car, and we were in beautiful nature places. We just camped everywhere. At this point in time, we didn't really focus in on contamination. It was just a matter of getting out to literally save my life. This was like the last straw that I had, that I thought, if we don't get out of here, I'm literally going to die, what you said earlier. And I felt so good in the 2 months that we were on the road. Like, I was feeling a lot better. I was able to hike and exercise, and so many symptoms had gone away for me. And then, we got to a point where we wanted to reintegrate back into civilization. We want to have a normal life. At this time, we're like, we don't really understand this, right? We're thinking, all right, if we just kind of stay in a newer apartment, a little bit out of the city, things are going to be okay. And so we jumped into an apartment. I think we were just tired of living on the road. And at that time, my husband had to go back to work. So he really needed a stable environment and a stable working Wi-Fi, which we now know you can still do on the road, because we're doing that now. But so we jumped into an apartment, and it was okay for a while. At that time, it was, we were still in the middle of the pandemic. There wasn't a lot of people around. The apartment complex was pretty empty, and so I felt like it suited our needs at that time. But as time went on, I never really saw major progress. I just kind of was stagnant in the way that I was feeling. And we also were using like high powered air purifiers. And I remember seeing something on one of the groups the other day where someone said, these air purifiers just keep us in bad environments longer. And I feel like that's kind of what happened with me, where we kind of set up these things for a false sense of security, and it didn't really do much. And so we got to a point where things changed in the environment. We had a big leak in the ceiling. I mean, this is like a new, nice apartment. This is not like junk, right? We're spending a premium thinking that this is going to be a saving grace for my health, to come to find out we have a leaking roof. And they come in and they bring a remediation team, and apparently they did a poor job, because as soon as we came back, it was like I was even worse than when we got there, when the roof leak was there. And it was so hard to even try to get any information out of my property manager. I tried to ask her, can you provide me the documents of the remediation plans and the testing, and let me know what you guys did. And they always want to divert liability. They don't want to be involved. And so they never did provide those documents. So I just had to go based upon how I was feeling. I really tried to stick through it as long as I could, just because we were coming to the end of our lease, and my husband was just like, can you please hold on? And I just got to a point where I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk. I was like extremely panic, anxiety, and I just told my husband, we have to go. And so he took me out of there, and we never went back. And we the mold tests that we did only showed a handful amount of Stachybotrys and trichoderma. And, according to our expertise, we know even just one spore is bad. But even if you don't find any spores, it doesn't mean that Stachybotrys is not there. But, we found it was like 15 spores, and, I just felt so defeated. We brought in a team that hit all the boxes, said that they do X, Y, and Z, but did something completely different. And I'm not there to micromanage what they're doing, because I'm sick and my husband's there, and he's not really understanding how remediation and testing and inspection works. So we got an air test back that just showed nothing, and the ERMI was what showed the stachy and the trichoderma, but it was so low, the spore count, it just wouldn't justify, breaking out of a lease, that we got stuck paying for this apartment that we couldn't live in. And, I felt like I was back at square one. I can't walk, can't talk, extremely sick, having my POTS symptoms. And so that started, our mold avoidance journey number 2, where we were just in hotels. And I think this time we really did it the right way. I think initially so many people want to either get into, a trailer, or they want to go tenting. But I just feel like when you're so sick, if you don't have the support, it's probably a lot easier to get into a hotel that's in a pristine area, where you can, get service every day from maid and change all the sheets and get into a shower. I mean, for a month, I couldn't wear clothes. I was so reactive that I could not wear any clothing, because I would react to the clothing. My husband couldn't be in the room with me because I was so reactive to him. My dog was with me, but I had to wash him every single day because he was detoxing through his coat. So I just spent a month in and out of hotel rooms, just naked in there, with the sheet, showering over and over. And that's just what I needed to do for, about a month. Would I do it again? Hell yeah. I don't want to feel bad. And if I know what I need to do to feel good, I will do it again. And I think initially doing that was really good. And then eventually, once I got to a point where I could tolerate things and clothes, I can tolerate being around my husband, that's when we decided to take the trailer route. And we've been just camping in really nice places, and it's been a godsend. I feel like a lot of the symptoms that I had a lot in the apartment are gone, and I'm just really grateful for Eric's advice and information on how to do this right, and also just being a part of exposing mold and kind of reiterating the fact to everyone else. And it's like, oh boy, I'm living this again. So let me do it right this time. let me control the contamination and be in the pristine locations. And that's what we did. So
I think it's so interesting that you said that your healing was just a little stagnant in the new apartment, because that was my exact experience when I moved in from like known mold to hidden mold. I'm like, I'm just recovering really slow here, but I had no idea it was because there was still something hiding here. And it's such a big difference from being in like a totally clear place where you can start to recover faster. I'm curious, we all know here that the term mold avoidance is taken out of its intended context by people who don't fully understand the term. So, what would you, Alicia, or even you, Eric, say to people who say mold avoidance is impossible because you can't avoid all mold?
I'm gonna let the OG mold avoider answer this one. Eric, you have to give us an answer.
Well, mold avoidance was just an experiment because during the Tahoe outbreak, people who were completely unable to recover back in town were just leaving, going someplace else, and getting somewhat better. And a couple of us discovered that by going out to the desert, we got better still. It seemed like the more pristine the environment, the more recovery. So I proposed the term mold avoidance. I went to researchers, chronic fatigue syndrome researchers, and I suggested that since this seems to help, we may as well study it. What's the harm? And I needed a term for it. And avoiding something, it's like just walking away. And I go, well, we need to put some strategy into this. And so the term I used was extreme mold avoidance. And that wasn't to mean that I was going to run from all molds. It just meant that I wanted to develop some kind of strategy and know what I was dealing with. So for that purpose, I went to places known to make people sick and just saw what it felt like. And then left, took a shower, changed my clothes, recovered a little bit, go somewhere else. And in the course of this, I realized that when I was in a bad place, if I kept my clothing in the same room where I was sleeping, that affected my sleep. If I didn't wash my hair well enough, it got in my pillow and I couldn't sleep. So extreme avoidance it grew to include the idea that a certain amount of decontamination is necessary in addition to simply avoiding the bad places. So I just wanted to explore this concept of what we can do about using our senses to detect these bad places and maximize our ability for detox. And of course, find out what it is, because not all molds are bad. So for that purpose, I hired a mold tester. By 1997, there was such a thing. In the early 1980s, that didn't even exist. But I managed to locate one who was shocked that I was even able to find him, because the profession was so obscure. It was completely like unheard of, unknown. Allergists, doctors, immunologists, they had no idea that a mold tester even existed. But I hired him to come up to Lake Tahoe, go around with me to various mold colonies, and I would disturb them until I found the one that was knocking me flat. And I did so. I messed up some penicillin, stirred it up, breathed it, didn't bother me. Aspergillus, lumberyard mold, no serious effect. Not exactly what I was looking for. Till we finally got to some black mold on sheetrock. It was from a plumbing leak in my bathroom. Cut a hole in the wall, and that did the trick. That just put me on the floor.
Mm.
I'm going, that's the one. What is it? And that's where I first learned that it was Stachybotrys chartarum. Actually, at the time, it was still called Stachybotrys atra. They were in the process of changing the name. So they seem to do that, keep people constantly confused. For example, the toxin from Stachybotrys is satratoxin, and that's from Stachybotrys atra. And when they changed the name, they didn't change it to chartarum toxin. They just kept the saprotoxin. And I have no idea why it's almost like they deliberately want to confuse people, but there it is. Name change, it really works to keep things a moving target. So I never meant to um, sell this or propose it as a viable treatment option, except if somebody's really desperate and wants to do it. It was just something to try. But of course, I did find a few people who do want to try it. They do care enough about their health to undertake a crazy experiment.
Mm-hmm.
But people who want to criticize me are portraying it as if mold avoidance is running from all mold. It's running from the sight of mold, the very thought of mold. And it's just something that Eric is selling because he wants to make a profit off of it. And I don't know why that's done. I mean, my motives were just to try to propose this to researchers so they would know what they were dealing with. They could study better, devise better treatments, and at least we could get a proper name for the illness that reflects what we're dealing with, rather than this vague, generalized concept of, well, like SIRS. What does that mean? When Dr. Shoemaker first was using biotoxin illness, it was a little bit confusing, but kind of clear. It was toxins from biological organisms. And then he transitioned into SIRS. I don't know why. It seems to be the same concept, but here we've got a new name, and he put more focus on things that were further away from the original target: Pfiesteria, blue-green algae, and toxic mold Stachybotrys in particular. And until finally, if you have a SIRS diagnosis, what does that mean? Is it Pfiesteria? Is it black mold? It seems to be presented now that once you're triggered by any of a number of factors, that you have SIRS, and now you have to do this protocol and buy air filters and use this strange name. Well, if you got sick from Pfiesteria, why not just call it Pfiesteria disease? Or ciguatoxin, it's post-ciguatoxin exposure. Or Stachybotrys, toxic mold exposure. What? Why not keep it unconfusing? So mold illness, when the first term first came about, was for Stachybotrys because that was the only toxic mold we knew of. Back in 1994, when Ruth Etzel publicized the Cleveland infant pulmonary hemorrhage incident, that was the only black mold hazard that we knew of. All the rest, they hadn't been found to be toxic. Rather, we knew about aspergillus as an infection, but not as a toxic inhalant. So mold illness, as it started out, was very specific. It was for the dreaded toxic black mold. And I still use it that way because I don't feel it's right for people to hijack a name and make it confusing by saying it's now inclusive of anything and everything, up to species of bacteria that aren't even fungi. They're not even mold.
I think
So
tomorrow.
I didn't know where this was going, but it's reached a point where now it's like ridiculous trying to use mold illness as a name for anything and everything that's inside a water damaged building. That does me no good, and it's taking away from the original intent and purpose of making up a name, mold illness and mold avoidance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we should even cover that in a little bit more detail tomorrow for MECFS Day, because the name changes is part of what keeps people sick and confused, and that's something that we talk about all the time. I love, Eric, how you pointed out that people think that you're running from all mold, because every time I hear someone or read someone say you can't avoid all mold, I just picture them thinking that we're like literally like dodging spores in the air. Like, what do they actually think? I just, before we wrap it up here, and either of you can chime in, but how do you think contamination or not understanding ideas of contamination affects people while they're doing mold avoidance? Because I know that there's some people who feel like they're bringing their problem with them, or they get even more sick. And it's like a lot of times you can tell by people's descriptions they're not understanding contamination. Alicia, I don't know if you want to share like your personal experience on that, or Eric, if you want to share a history from the past, but I just think that that's the contamination piece is so important for people to understand. And for anyone who doesn't understand like mold avoidance or wants coaching with mold avoidance, Alicia has single sessions and coaching for mold avoidance on our website. And Eric does consults with healthcare providers about like the higher order concepts of like the molecular binding behind contamination and like some of the like the science part of this stuff, so that health providers can more honestly support their patient base. But before we wrap up here, let's touch on the contamination piece.
Well, I'd just like to say that in the course of my experiments, taking samples of Stachybotrys to a safe location and seeing how I would react to it, I noticed that during storms, there would be an amplification of its power. It would actually, the range at which it would affect me would increase dramatically, and it seemed more toxic. And contamination can often be hidden because it will be on an object. You bring it into your environment at a point where it's kind of quiescent, not really affecting you all that much. A storm comes in, all of a sudden you feel terrible. You don't know where it came from. So if you understand the idea that contamination can be brought in and then amplify during times of atmospheric weather change, you can make more sense of it, possibly remove that contaminated object, get it back out of there and feel better again.
Another thing too is like people think mold avoidance is going out into the desert in a tent, and that's kind of what people have mocked you with, Eric. But it's not like that. Like I said, my second sabbatical was started in hotels. I mean, you could get out and find an area that feels a lot better to you and stay in there and stay in a hotel and do it that way. It's not just you have to get in the tent in the desert, and there's so many misconceptions. It's literally getting out of the bad environment, controlling that contamination piece, and doing it in a location that feels better to you. So
yeah, I said, how can a better attempt or a more concerted effort at mold avoidance be worse than making a lesser attempt? I mean, any time any toxin affects you, whatever slight effort you can do to get away from it can only be a good thing.
absolutely. And we're just going to wrap up here, and we're going to look at your questions that we have coming in the comments. We have Janet here saying greetings. Thanks for the live. Jess, thank you for sharing. How do you find hotels in pristine areas? Eric, would you want to answer that, or I can answer that?
Well, I go out to a wilderness, a forest, a desert, some area that's likely to feel good, and I get clear as possible. I try to feel as good as I possibly can, get lots of fresh air, and then I go directly to the place that I propose to attempt to sense. And I approach it slowly and see if I can tell anything walking up to the front door, because in a badly contaminated building, people going in and out the door are going to be dropping contamination as they go. So very often you can sense it right at the entrance, even before you go in. And if you do that and turn around, if you feel anything and get away from there, you've already decided that it's not good. You won't be contaminated, and you can go somewhere else and try that out. And if you finally make it into a hotel, decide that you don't really feel anything quite yet, the first thing I do is go into the bathroom, because that's where the condensation is, and I lay on the floor. On the base, don't let people watch you do this. They'll think you're crazy. Do a distraction. Yay, what's that over there? Get them out of your way. And all you have to do is just get near the floor for a minute, because the horizontal accumulations of mold, if there's any present, will be more discernible laying flat on the floor with your breathing very, very close to the floor.
I'd like to add to that too. I mean, I've been in areas where like we literally need to find a hotel and are desperate. We walk into the lobby feels bad, but going up to the room feels fine. And so there's situations like that too. It's just really touchy. And at the end of the day, you really just have to trust your senses and how you feel. That is most important. I have Stephen Ross from YouTube. How long does it take to recover from Stachybotrys poisons? Typically, he's been 6 months out. He got rid of all his stuff. His main symptoms are extreme fatigue and brain fog still.
I don't think you can really you can't project an expected recovery time, because the problem is, they say, well, your detox pathways are blocked. And I believe that that's essentially what this illness is. You hit something that's so bad that you're not detoxing. And even when you get out to the desert, if you have any contamination around you, or it's a less than ideal environment from, say, cyanotoxins, that can keep you from detoxing. So it can look like you're going through the motions of avoidance, but until we understand these variables and know a little better what we're dealing with, I really don't think we can say, well, you've been out in the desert in a tent for 6 months, so that ought to be, that's proof that you've detoxed. We just don't know at that point. A lot of people react to their tents. They have to get another tent because the one they're trying to live in had flame retardant or some kind of chemical on it, and that was keeping them from detoxing.
Yeah, and if you're on Facebook, Stephen, you can check out the toxic mold support groups, and you can hear a lot of anecdotal stories about people getting well, in a span of 1 to 2 years. It could take a while, and depending on your circumstances, as Eric just mentioned. I have Jess here. What about running from MT and super toxins? I think I'm reacting to all of it. Boy, this MT and the whole bit on MT really chaps my ass. And this is going to be a whole other live that we'll do and we'll cover, because I feel like there's so much craziness about this MT stuff that I think we definitely need to address. So do stay tuned for that. I have Elizabeth here. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona with MT. Again, how far away from Phoenix would I have to go to get away from Phoenix? I personally was in Scottsdale. The whole entire Phoenix area feels terrible to me. I can't even be in that entire city without gasping for a breath. The area that felt really good to me was Anthem up north, which is a little town right outside of Phoenix. There is a lot of hotels if you do want to stay there. Lake Pleasant felt really good. You can camp there. I believe it's BLM land, so you can camp there for free, or I think it might be $15 through the state of Arizona land management. And then anything up north from there feels fine before you hit Prescott. Then it gets a little hairy, especially since there's fires right now. Janet Jones, so true. Cindy says, how do you deal with a situation where you have to leave and leave everything behind? I am now court ordered to remove my property or belongings. Nobody I know will touch it because of mold. Keely or Eric, do you have any question or any advice for Cindy?
Well, if at all possible, hire somebody to put it all in storage.
Can we circle back to Jess, because she says, what about running from MT and super toxins? I think I'm reacting to all of it. So Jess, this happens to people when they leave, even if you've abandoned like 90% of your stuff and you still are exposed to any contamination, are in a bad area, or have something like your car that you're in that you're contaminated in. This is what we refer to, well, I call this, and I think I'm using it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, this is like an intensification phase where you haven't fully unmasked, you haven't fully refined your mold avoidance strategy senses, meaning to like fully understand when you're near a contaminated item to point to it and say, that's bothering me. And then when you're in this phase, literally everything feels awful. And it's a limited time window where everything bothers you that intensely. But this, I would suspect, is rooted in not understanding contamination and not being fully unmasked. And these are actually things that we personally work with people on to help them understand so that you can develop the strategies that you need to hope to recover. Sorry to interrupt you, Alicia. Go ahead with the questions.
No worries. But we'll definitely have an in-depth live on MT where we'll cover even more of that.
If I could just make one small observation about this mystery toxin.
Sure.
That actually was Lisa Peterson's idea. And at first I thought, well, it doesn't really harm to call it mystery toxin because it is a mystery and people accept that. I tried to use a vague term like the badness or the stuff or the substance, the agent X. And very deliberately because we don't know what it is. I mentioned that something about the mold was amplifying during storms. And I mean, I could take a contaminated object and the atmospheric conditions would bring out some kind of special toxicity. And this isn't a known property of mold. So I wanted a vague term to represent how something can almost explode in potency unexpectedly and study that. And when people started making up names like mystery toxin, hell toxin, this or that toxin, frat, they assigned a specific quantity to it, like it was connected with a particular substance, and I'm not sure that it is. And people started thinking of it in too specific of a term, and they would actually think of that as being different from hell toxin, when it may be that this thing they're thinking of as hell toxin that contaminates so badly and explodes in power, it's just the same as mystery toxin, but worse, a worse level of it. But it may be the same process. Now, we just had a comment about mold is not the problem. Well, when we tried to ask for help with mold initially, you couldn't do it. It was rejected. The doctors would say, well, mold doesn't do that, so mold is not the problem. Well, something from mold is, and we have to look at the mold in order to get you to look at whatever the mold is doing before we can understand what's going on. When they're studying malaria, it's from mosquitoes. How are you going to find it if you don't look at the mosquitoes?
That's a good point. And I feel like so many people get angry when you try to pinpoint something as being the problem. And I don't understand that. Well, let's figure it out. Let's find out if it is the problem or not. And I think that is the problem, is that we're not actively looking into it because there's no grants and, to study toxic mold. People are not interested in looking into it because there is no money for research into it. So that's the problem.
Well, because mold isn't known to act this way, the first thing they say is, well, it's got to be more than mold. It's not mold. Well, but it seems to be emanating from mold. So in order to find whatever the heck is going on, you have to look at the mold.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eric. And we're going to go into our last question here from Janet Jones. Which organ should be detoxed first? The kidneys? That's been proposed and makes sense.
Got a choice?
I'll jump in here. So the organ that should be addressed first is whichever one is giving you the most symptoms. The Shoemaker protocol addresses like gallbladder sludge pretty heavily with the CSM, and I can see how that makes sense. There's a lot of gallbladder pathology with mold illness. But if someone's primary problem is water retention, you'd want to look at if the kidneys are filtering. If someone's primary problem is migraines, you might want to look at something else. So I don't think that there's a solid one size fits all answer. I think that would be on a case by case basis. I think that there could be a family of 5 and they could all have different primary symptoms that would all need to be addressed differently. Eric, do you have a different opinion on that you want to share?
Oh, I just don't know a thing about it.
Oh.
When I watched people trying all these detox protocols, it seemed like none of them were working. But of course, they weren't doing mold avoidance. So I just kind of lost interest in focusing on that.
Mm-hmm. I will say for me, it was my kidneys, but I had a lot of like fluid retention, kidney stones. I had a lot of problems with my bladder. I had a lot of clues to indicate my kidneys and my bladder weren't working well. And other people are going to have other clues of different organ dysfunction. So.
And Eric, when you were doing mold avoidance, a lot of this stuff resolved on its own, correct?
Yeah. That was the main stunning observation. A couple of us in Incline Village went out to the desert and our food reactivities just melted away. I mean, here back in town, we couldn't eat cheese, wine, nuts, bread, gluten intolerance. And all we did is get out to the desert. And within a very short period of time, we were eating beer and pizza. It's like, hallelujah.
I know. I mean, that's one symptom that goes away for me is the intolerance to food and the gluten and all that. And now that I'm in pristine air, I can enjoy all of it. And I'm just like, yes, I spent 10 years of my life avoiding everything bad and eating like a rabbit. Now I can actually enjoy food. So thank you,
that's
Eric.
something that we talk about all the time, that MCAS might actually just be like an advanced symptom of mold hypersensitivity, and people are thinking that it's a completely separate condition. Mold isn't their illness, only MCAS is, and contamination keeps people in that state, and they don't really realize that. Okay, last question. Carrie says, I'm house sitting for my friends. Sewage is overflowing outdoors, bubbling up the sink and shower drains. This is causing a terrible twisted involuntary clenching in hands and fingers, as well as other symptoms. Should I flee? Carrie, my answer would be absolutely get out of there before you, if your hands and fingers are clenching, that's an advanced state. I wouldn't stick around in sewage sludge. Anyone else have an opinion?
Yeah, that was happening to me too. Just involuntary, just fingers just going off in weird directions, and the cramps, terrible. So yeah, when it gets to that point, it's time to go.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a great conversation as usual, and we really enjoy all of your questions and your input, whether you agree or not. We love it all. Tomorrow we're going to do another live. It's going to be MECFS Awareness Day, I believe. So we are going to do a special live on that, and Eric will take the lead and educate us. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.